Welcome to the High Bar.
Great talking to you.
Did you write that down on a piece of paper?
Your weekly watering hole for lighthearted conversation with people who care about culture that matters. I'm Warren Etheridge, your host and barkeep. I promise never to cut anyone off while encouraging all to think responsibly.
Just like you have to really listen.
But Jose, good question. You know, but that kind of was. That's a good question.
Join me now at the luscious Volterra in Seattle, Washington, as I welcome esteemed broadcaster Tavis Smiley and revered rabble-rouser Dr. Cornel West to raise a toast to and raise the bar for economic justice. Well, thank you so much for joining me today, Dr. Cornel West, Tavis Smiley.
Warren, good to be on with you. Thank you.
Warren. Thank you so much for this book. Truly, I imagine that this is the book that's going to do for Obama what The Other America did for Michael Harrington's The Other America did for LBJ. Is that the goal?
That's a high bar. You know? No pun intended. That is a high bar.
Very much so. I think the difference would be, of course, we've got a social movement in place, Occupy movement, the other citizens awakening about the misery and poverty of working people and poor people. So we got a real social movement along with this text and a host of others.
In the book, you cite Adam Smith, who talks about wherever there is great prosperity, there is also inequality. Does the reverse hold true? If we have fiscal equality, does that mean that we're not going to have prosperity?
No, I think it's more complicated than that. I think we're actually talking about massive job programs at a living wage that contribute to demand, that generate higher levels of productivity and growth, but a more equal distribution of that growth.
Right.
That's what we're after. 1% of the population got 93% of the income growth, 2010, something wrong with that.
Right, and it's gotten worse since The Other America, when it was only 25% of the country living at the poverty line, essentially, right? And now we're up to 50%, really.
Well, again, that 50%, Tavis makes a point rightly, so it's near poverty
Right.
as well as poverty. So
Right.
Harrington really didn't talk about near poverty in '62 in that classic, yeah.
Well, I can speak to near poverty.
That's funny. That's funny, but most Americans can. This is what the book is all about. When you have so many Americans, Warren, who are just a paycheck or two away from being in poverty, that's how that number becomes so massive. You have the perennially poor or the persistent poor. On top of that, you have the new poor. We argue in the text that the new poor are the former middle class. Then you have the near poor, those who are just a paycheck or two away. It's 150 million Americans. So that half the country is either in poverty or low income. And what we argue in the book is that those numbers are not sustainable. You cannot advance a democracy where you have wealth concentrated in the hands of a few. Louis Brandeis, we quote in the book, once said, you can have wealth concentrated in the hands of a few, or you can have democracy. You can't have both. So the book suggests and argues, more than suggests, says very clearly that poverty threatens our democracy. Poverty is a matter of national security, and that's why we're trying to put this issue higher on the American agenda.
Well, it's true, not just what you cite here in the book, but Richard Wilkinson and Kate Pickett wrote that book, The Spirit Level, which after 30 years of studies proved that fiscal inequality is bad for everybody, even the people who have the money. So where's the outrage? I know there's Occupy Wall Street, but where's the I want to see?
It's a wonderful question. It's a wonderful question. Look at the prison industrial complex. Look at the trade union movement being pushed against the wall by bosses and oligarchs at the top. Where's the moral outrage? Well, a lot of our fellow citizens, addicted, self-medicated, complacent, and in some sense feeling relatively impotent. And what we're trying to do is reactivate the democratic energy and say, we can make a difference and we care about poor and working.
But I would add to that. I don't think we don't agree on everything, but I don't think Doc would disagree on this. And to your point, beyond Occupy, which is significant, Americans are concerned about this. Every poll, every survey, every study that I've read suggests that anger, that angst is starting to build. Take, for example, Citigroup. This is not just outside anger, there's inside anger now. When you have shareholders who are pushing back on CEO pay inside of a major company like Citigroup, and that makes the front page of the New York Times and every other business paper in the country, a business journal, that's significant. So you see that angst starting to build on the inside, you see it building on the outside. One of the reasons why the media even, and we talk about media complicity in poverty not being a priority in this country, but even the media is starting to talk more about it. I noticed that public radio has a poverty anchor desk. Now, there's a poverty desk inside of public radio, and most of the major news media are at least tracking this story because it's no longer, again, just black and brown. We say in the book, poverty isn't color-coded. We took a poverty tour last summer, 11 states, 18 cities, and saw that Americans of all races, all colors, all creeds are starting to suffer from this. When you hear President Obama sounding like an Occupy Wall Street protester in his State of the Union speech this year, that populist message that he's starting to deliver, he didn't do that by choice. He was pushed into changing his own strategy. So I think it's going to be a fascinating year. By no means is the outrage, the protest as aggressive as we think it needs to be, but there are signs that anger is starting to grow.
As it is towards phones that ring during the middle of interviews.
That happens.
That's something to deal with. So the movement has to start with the people, though? We can't expect it from our leaders, can we?
Well, it's both. We call for a conference for the eradication of poverty. It can be top-down if leadership is bold and courageous, but it's also got to be bottom-up. It's got to be citizens organizing and mobilizing, and most importantly, using the righteous indignation to focus on injustice and highlight the possibility of justice, because that righteous indignation can be bigoted. It can be anti-Semitic, anti-Arab, anti-terror, homophobic, anti-black, anti-brown, anti-red. So the real challenge, this is the legacy of Martin King and Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel and Dorothy Day. How do you ensure that rage takes a moral venue rather than an immoral venue?
In this conference on poverty eradication that Doc referenced, Warren, it's not just a conference, it's a White House conference on the eradication of poverty.
That's right.
To your earlier wonderful question about Lyndon Johnson, we have not had a leader in this country, president, Republican or Democrat, since Lyndon Johnson, who has said, I am going to make poverty eradication a priority. So that there seems to be, as we argue in the book, a bipartisan consensus that the poor don't matter, that poverty ought not to be a priority. But when you have a president who uses the bully pulpit, who says that I am going to tie my legacy to the fate of poor people in this country, that makes a difference. So if Obama would, if he were to be reelected, or Mr. Romney, or whoever may be coming that we don't know of at the moment, a third party candidate, whoever the next president of the United States is, just like Barack Obama signed Lilly Ledbetter for equity, for women in the workplace as his first official act, the next president ought to, as his first official act, call together a White House conference on the eradication of poverty, bring the experts together, and let's craft a national plan. Very quickly, here's what is so disturbing for both Doc and myself, is that we know how to do this. We say all the time, this is not a skill problem, it's a will problem. There are so many plans already in this country, from Catholic Charities to Children's Defense Fund to Jeffrey Sachs at Columbia to Jim Wallace at Sojourners to institutions and think tanks and colleges and universities. There are all kinds of plans out there for how we can eradicate poverty in this country over a time certain, 10, 15, 25 years. Again, it's not a skill problem, it's a will problem. We have not come together seriously with a national plan to make poverty a priority, and that, Doc is right, it happens from the top down and the bottom up, but at the very least, it ought to happen from our leaders in Washington.
Right. But part of that is changing the whole, the branding of poverty to some extent, because it is so stigmatized. And I was serious, as somebody who, years ago had a good job, lost it, then lost my car, lost my home, lost all my savings. I was there. There's not only the poverty part, but there's also the bad credit and just the equivalent of the scarlet A that you get once you lose everything.
Susie Orman, who we quote in the book, has a great line, Warren. She says there's a highway into poverty, but not even a sidewalk out, is what you're saying. So many people get in, and it's almost impossible to get out. And that stigma is real. We quote, and not just quote, do some deconstruction on a Pew study that talked about the psychology of people and why they don't want to acknowledge or admit that they are poor, even they've lost, as you did and I have and others have, even we've lost everything. Something about that word. So poor really is a four-letter word, pun intended, and nobody wants to be associated with it. Why? Because, as Doc and I argue in the book, we have for so long demonized and criminalized poor people. We've made them invisible. We've seen them as the other. So even when we get caught up in that, through no fault of our own, nobody wants to acknowledge that they are that. And so many Americans are suffering in silence as a result of that stigma.
Right, because who wants to talk about it?
Precisely.
Now, there's an element of that when you talk about how that was almost used as a stick for the middle class, essentially, right?
Absolutely.
In that it's almost conspiratorial in a way. Let's not talk about the poor or only use them as you don't want to be those guys.
You don't want to be those guys. Michael Moore makes that point with great power in this text as part of the gathering that Tavis brought together in New York City at NYU. But what we need to do is just shatter the stereotypical perception of poor people. They are Americans of all colors. Most of them worked hard by no fault of their own. They lost their job, then their home, health care, and if we can't come to their aid the way we came to the aid of investment bankers, $16 trillion running interest-free loans. It would be nice if our students could get interest-free loans, given the student debt now exceeds credit card debt. That's the kind of issues that we're hitting here in terms of the reinvigoration of American democracy by keeping track of the precious humanity of poor people.
Well, you mentioned student loans, and clearly education is an important matter.
Yes.
But $4 billion invested in education is not enough when it's $4 billion, in, as you point out, in Afghanistan on a daily basis.
This is
right?
drop in the bucket.
Right.
Drop in the bucket, absolutely.
Is that where to start, or is it in some sort of commercial campaign like, you know, I'm a Mormon, something like I'm a poor person?
Well, I mean, we the 60 Minutes program, how long ago was it, Brother Terry?
Just a few weeks ago, yeah.
Just a few weeks ago, when you put the white brothers and sisters' face on poverty,
Right.
it does shift as opposed to the black faces and the brown face, and it's let us never forget our precious indigenous peoples.
Right.
We don't have a red face on poverty, but we know they, of course, suffer
Right.
disproportionately as well. But there's more white brothers and sisters on wrestling with poverty than any other group in this nation.
So it does reach everybody, certainly.
Everybody.
So now you talk about this thing about if Obama's reelected or Romney, and you talk about how there has to be a conversation about it. You are the gifted conversationalist. How do we get people to talk about it during the campaign?
By doing what we're doing, and we're not the only ones doing it. And Doc and I say very clearly in the text, we don't have a monopoly on truth. We don't have all the ideas. This is what we think about the issue, and our recommendations are here. Policy recommendations and cultural, social, political recommendations. But we have to have more people in the media, because the media has been complicit in this, in not raising these issues. I'm on television every day, and obviously you are as well. And it's a vast wasteland oftentimes. I believe that television, particularly public television, is at its best when we use these platforms, public radio for that matter, which Doc and I do every week. These mediums are at their best, Warren, when we use them to challenge folk to re-examine the assumptions they hold, when we help folk to expand their inventory of ideas, when we use these platforms to introduce Americans to each other and get folk to look at these problems, look at poverty through a different prism. And there's just not enough of that happening in the media. And so one of the reasons why we're starting to get more traction on this issue, frankly, a bunch of white folk are falling into poverty now. So now
I'll do it every time.
Yeah, every time. That's all you need. Who knew? If we could have impoverished some white folk years ago, we might have another conversation a while ago.
And I would add, though, white middle class.
White middle class,
brothers and sisters, because there are a lot of poor white brothers and sisters been poor for a long time. And very few people really have it.
But we counted them as black, essentially. I think that's what
but the media clearly has a role to play. And I think, again, it's going to be fascinating for, and Doc and I keep making this point, it's going to be fascinating, Warren, to watch how Romney and Obama campaign, how they pivot on poverty, if I can use that, how they pivot on poverty this year. Because politicians typically, as you know, want to speak, as you said earlier, to the angst of the middle class. Well, if we're right, we think we are, that the new poor are the former middle class, who are you talking to this time? You know, with the middle class disappearing, and so many of them now, wrestling with poverty, that line, that strategy isn't necessarily going to work this time, particularly for Mr. Romney, who wants to suggest that any talk about the poor is engaging in the politics of envy. I mean, it's going to be fascinating to watch this. But again, I hope this time around, unlike the last time, 3 debates between Obama and McCain, poverty or poor doesn't come up one time. McCain doesn't raise it, Obama doesn't raise it, the moderators don't ask about it. I can't imagine, although I'm not holding my breath, I can't imagine this time around they're going to get away without having to talk about poverty.
You should be one of the moderators.
Well, that ain't going to happen.
That would be wonderful. That would be very wonderful.
Yeah, you got a better shot at that than I do. Yeah.
No, but I think
Cornel West would not be one of the moderators.
No, that I know.
But Brother Bob Schieffer, if he is the moderator, he's going to raise it.
He is. You got some inside word on that?
We did Face the Nation a few days ago.
Just from the conversation we had with that brother on Face the Nation, he feels it.
He feels it.
Oh, yes.
That's going to go there. But Romney is speaking to the poor. He's just shaming the poor in the
Yeah,
process,
exactly right.
right? Now, why is he so tone deaf? Is it sort of an extinction burst thing where he feels he's got to hold on to?
You were in Massachusetts when he was governor. Can you speak for Mitt Romney, sir? You were at Harvard when he was governor of Massachusetts.
Yeah, but he was very different then, He had different constituency, he had different strategies, different policies. He's changed quickly.
Right.
he may end up liberal by the time this whole thing is. You never know.
Etch a sketch.
He's supposed to do anything to win, you know. All of a sudden, the Occupy movement shifts the whole nation toward the left, and he and Martin Luther King Jr. is my legacy. Okay, Brother Mint, appreciate it.
So clearly you do believe in change. It can happen, right? How do you keep up hope? I mean, when I read about this book, what I love is not only do you have so many bright things to say about poverty and what we can do about it, but just the stories of the people you meet. And as great as the stories are, it seems like it'd be so sad-making after a while. Where do you take the hope from?
Well, there's brothers like yourself, Tavis Smiley, a whole lot of sisters and others of all colors who care. And as long as there's caring out there, and there's kindness and sweetness and commitment to justice, it's not suffocated, it's not snuffed out, you got a source of hope.
I would add two things to that. One, and Doc and I say this all the time, when you see the fight back of the people who are wrestling with poverty,
yes,
it lifts your spirits. People are not laying down and rolling over, and people are trying to be creative. They're becoming social entrepreneurs.
That's right.
They're coming up with all kinds of ideas. Families are pulling together. I know in my own family, I've got 9 brothers and sisters, so I'm not removed from poverty. It's in my own immediate family, and I've helped brothers and sisters try to hold on to their homes, and we've had to consolidate. And I mean, so I know this in my own immediate family with my 9 siblings. So one, when you see the fight back of everyday people, that lifts your spirits, number one. And number two, this book starts out, as you know, Warren, with both Dr. West and I explaining how poverty became an issue for us and what our connection to poverty was as young people. Dr. King is a young person growing up in Sacramento, California. He worked in the breakfast program for the Black Panthers. So even as a child, he was already engaged in trying to uplift poor people. I lived this poverty story. 10 kids, my mother, my father, my grandmother, Big Mama, 13 of us in a 3-bedroom, 1-bathroom trailer in a trailer park with a bunch of other white folks. I know about being a poor black person around a bunch of poor white people, so Doc is right about what he suggested earlier. The point is, I'm a witness, I'm an example that you can come out of poverty and build a whole life on hope. You can build a whole life on hope, but we say all the time that even hope needs help. And that's where you come in, and Doc comes in, I come in, all the others who are trying to raise this issue. We got to give hope. So Obama's talking about hope. Well, hope needs some help. Right. And we got to push him, and we got to push Mr. Romney and anybody else. We got to push them. Great presidents aren't born, they're made. We say all the time, there is no Abraham Lincoln without Frederick Douglass pushing him. Right. There is no FDR without A. Philip Randolph pushing him. There is no LBJ without MLK pushing him. Barack Obama, if he gets reelected, is going to have to be pushed. And for Mitt Romney, I don't know what.
We'll get a lever and a pulley. We'll see what we can do.
Yeah, I don't know. We have to pray for that brother, as Doc would say.
Well, I think if either one of them wins, we still have to hit the streets and fill the jails, civil disobedience, a social movement that looks for bringing to bear peaceful, strong political pressure, because the oligarchs are going to rule no matter what. Both parties tied to big money, both parties tied to the oligarchs, Wall Street, and corporate elites. But there's no doubt that Barack Obama has an openness to policies that affect the poor in a more positive way than Romney. But neither party, for the most part, has too much going on. Now you got Sister Jill Stein and Rocky Anderson out there in the Green and Justice parties who are raising their voices, and it's a beautiful thing. But we can see just how broken down our political system is, dominated by big money.
That's not changing anytime soon, sadly. Yeah. So I know that redistribution of wealth is a very divisive way of looking at things, and it seems to really get to folks. But, prior to the Roman Empire, we had this idea in civilizations that debt would be forgiven between countries, just wipe the slate clean. Would that be a possible alternative? Wipe the slate clean for everybody and start fresh? Or I'm really dreaming now.
Well, I mean, we've seen it with the IMF vis-a-vis other nations around the world. There's no doubt about that. And I would like to see something like that in terms of mortgage relief for working people who lost their homes, if not wiped clean, at least minimized with a lowering of interest rates, so people have access to the capital and credit needed to stay in the homes or getting access to their homes. But wiping it clean across the board, that might be a little bit too much. That's like biblical text, Jubilee, every 7 years. Just wipe it clean.
But speaking of which, though, speaking of Jubilee, though, in 2000, I was very much involved in an organization called Jubilee 2000. Mm-hmm. We met with the late, great Pope then, John Paul II, Bono, and Randall Robinson, Quincy Jones, a bunch of us met to meet with the Pope and at the Vatican and others around the globe. pushing for debt relief of these underdeveloped nations. So I think there is something to that. I don't know if we can wipe the slate clean across the board, but certainly for those nations that are struggling, those nations that are underdeveloped, there's something that can be done, ought to be done to relieve some of their debt, because poverty obviously is a global crisis. This book focuses mostly on what's happening in poverty here in the country, but there is something to that. Again, I don't know if it can be across the board, but relieving debt of countries that are struggling, trying to make it, underdeveloped nations, there's something to that idea.
I'd just like to champion the idea of too small to fail for myself.
Yeah, you know what? Not a bad idea. Not a bad idea.
Well, great book, The Rich and the Rest of Us, and what I take away is you mentioned Dr. King and you mentioned Dorothy Day. What you didn't say there, which is in the book, that it's about love. And I really appreciate the love that you've brought to this book and that you're taking out on tour, and thank you for fighting for so many of us.
Dr. West calls this a love tour. And it could not be more concisely put. That's what this is. It's a love tour. If you want to lead people, Doc says all the time, if you want to lead people, you got to love people. If you want to save people, you got to try to serve people. What it really means to be a leader is to love and serve people. So all that matters is what's the depth of your love, what's the quality of your service, and we're trying to enact that in our own way every day.
Now I know why we don't have good leaders.
There you go. That's the point. That is the point.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you so much.
Thank you,
Good to
sir.
see you. Appreciate it.
That was wonderful.
So witty, man. So freaking witty.
Normally at this point of the show, I'm supposed to say something pithy or wise, something like that. But please, instead, allow me a little geeky fanboy moment here. I just spoke with Tavis Smiley and Dr. Cornel West, and I'm a little blown away. So if you want to know more about poverty, don't come to me. I live it. But instead, read the book, The Rich and the Rest of Us. Thank you, Tavis. Thank you, Dr. Cornel West. You're both fantastic. Yay! Cheers. Most Americans will agree that our education system is in trouble, certainly, but very few can agree on what to do about it. But you may have a one-stop shop of a solution. What is that?
I think it's really critical to support teachers, and I don't believe that as a country that we support them the way that we should. And so we're trying to build a movement around not only supporting them, but elevating the profession so that great teachers can stay in their job. 46% leave within the first 5 years, and that so college kids want to do this job. It's really amazing because when you ask college kids if they want to teach, a lot of them want to. And then when you ask them who's going into teaching, very few do that because they don't want to take a vow of poverty.
Now, clearly, money is important and salary is important. When you talk about that attrition rate and people are leaving after 5 years, is it just because of the money, do you think?
No, it's an incredibly stressful job, and teachers don't feel supported and they don't have the working conditions that help them feel successful. And the kids come with an enormous amount of needs, and so the work is always going to be very, very challenging. I always think wimps need not apply, you know? The work is always going to be challenging, and it is true that the salary is not the number one reason that teachers say that they leave, but it's usually 2, 3, or 4. And so the way that I see it is I'd like to eliminate that reason so that we can stay in schools, build lattice work to support communities in schools, and then solve some of the other problems. In urban centers, 20% of teachers leave each year. And so you have to imagine a principal's situation where the principal is trying to lead a school and 1/5 of her staff is gone. She can't build an academic happy culture when she's needing to retrain all the people that are coming in. So that sort of, that just the coming in and out, I think, is so destructive to building a really strong institution.
The problem that you're talking about in terms of what's being reported is that's the standard news cycle. It peaks for a little while and it goes out of range, right? So who is responsible? Is it Apple, or is it the electronics makers? Is it the Chinese government? Is it that special economic zone? Is it the media for not reporting this? Is it us?
Well, it's us. I mean, and us is a superset that actually includes all those people, you know what I mean? Like we, human beings, we live in the West. We actually passed labor laws. People fought and died for there to be, what we would consider today relatively normal labor conditions. The idea that children should not be working, the idea that there is such a thing as a work week and it has limits to how long it is. Things like sick leave, even the idea that there's workman's comp and people who injure themselves on the job that their employer pays to help them. None of those things exist there. Yet there's all this infrastructure. They have all this industrialization that came from us. So we exported our jobs and none of our values. Like, we sent the jobs there, and they set up this special economic zone with the help of all our corporations. And when they designed it, they very specifically didn't put any labor standards in. And so, I mean, we bear a lot of responsibility for what's happening in that zone because our corporations were the ones that made it the way it is.